You're an old man who spent his whole life squinting at other people's handwriting, Walter, and you still didn't see this one coming. Diane said it in front of 40 people, at a table with white linen and candles shaped like anniversary numbers, and for a moment nobody in that banquet room moved at all. Somewhere behind me a string quartet kept playing, some slow, warm piece nobody had chosen for this, and no one seemed to notice it was still going. A fork touched a plate. That was the only sound besides the music. My daughter Emily's hand froze halfway to her water glass. My son Marcus stared at the tablecloth like it had personally wronged him, and I sat there in my good navy sweater, 63 years old, holding a small velvet box I'd been saving for the toast, feeling exactly like the old service dog people stop bothering to walk because everyone's already decided it can't keep up anymore. My name is Walter Graves. For 35 years I examined signatures for a living, forged wills, forged checks, forged loan documents, forged love letters entered as evidence in divorces uglier than this one was about to become. Banks flew me in, courts swore me in. Attorneys paid me by the hour to look at two versions of the same name and tell them, under oath, which one was a lie. I built a reputation on being the man who could catch what everyone else missed, right down to the way a person's pen hesitates half a millimeter before it commits to a letter it doesn't quite believe in. I retired 4 years ago, at 59, and I told everyone it was because my eyes needed the rest. That wasn't true, and we'll get to why later, because it matters more than you'd think. What matters right now is that 11 days before my 50th wedding anniversary party, my former protege Priya Shah called me from the fraud department of First Meridian Bank and asked if I still had a magnifying loupe in the house. I need you to picture the goal now, because everything after this is really just the machinery for getting there. By the night of that anniversary party, I intended to make sure that Diane Graves and the man who had taught her how to forge my signature would stand in front of everyone we knew and answer for exactly what they had done, and they would do it without a single dollar of what they thought they'd already stolen. That's the promise. Now let me take you back 4 weeks to where this actually started, because a man doesn't get blindsided by his own wife of 31 years without a long, quiet runway of things he chose not to look at too closely. I should tell you about the tremor first, because I never told Diane, and because a man who spent his whole career reading tiny details in other people's hands eventually has to live with what it feels like when his own hands stop cooperating. It started small, maybe 6 years ago. A faint shiver when I held a pen steady for too long, worse under stress, worse in the mornings before coffee. For a working document examiner, that's not an inconvenience. That's a resignation letter. I couldn't testify in court with a hand that trembled on cross-examination. Not when the entire discipline lives or dies on the jury believing you have God's own steady hand. So at 59, I told my firm I wanted more time to travel, more time with Diane, more time to finally build the little workshop in the garage where my father used to keep his watchmaking tools. I'd never told her the real reason. I let her believe I simply got tired. I let my own children believe their father just decided one day that he'd had enough of magnifying glasses and courtrooms. Looking back, that was the first mistake, though not the last, and not even close to the worst one. My father, Henrik Graves, was a locksmith and a watchmaker in a little shop 2 blocks from the harbor, and he was the one who first taught me to look at things nobody else bothered to look at. The burr on a key that had been filed twice, the hairline scratch inside a watch case that meant somebody had opened it who wasn't supposed to. He died when I was 26, 3 years before I met Diane, and the only thing I have from him that isn't a tool is a letter he wrote me the year before he passed, one he never sent, one I found folded inside his old tool chest after the funeral. I'll tell you what it says later. Not yet. It matters too much to rush. Diane and I met at a courthouse, of all places, back when I was 29, and she was a court reporter with a laugh loud enough to get her shushed by 3 separate judges in 1 week. We married the following spring. We built a life the way most people do, in installments, a house we could barely afford, then could afford, then paid off. 2 children, Marcus and Emily, 11 months apart, loud and difficult in hours. A decade of Sunday dinners that somehow never got old, even when they should have. I gave her everything I had, and I mean that as an actual accounting, not a sentiment. Over 3 decades, I turned down 4 job offers in other cities because she didn't want to leave her mother. I worked weekends for 11 straight years to pay off the house before either of us turned 50, so we'd never have to worry about a mortgage crushing us in retirement. When her father's hardware business went under in the 90s, I quietly co-signed a loan that took me 6 years to finish paying, and I never once mentioned it to her because I didn't marry her to keep score. I'm not telling you this to sound like a saint. I'm telling you because you need to understand what I thought I knew about my own marriage before I tell you what I actually found out. The first small wrongness showed up on a Tuesday morning in March, 4 weeks before the anniversary party, when I went looking for our property tax statement in the fireproof lockbox we kept in the hall closet, the same lockbox that had held our documents for 20 years, right where it always sat. The box was there. The folder for the house wasn't. Now, a normal 63-year-old man might think nothing of a missing folder. Documents get moved, reorganized, misfiled by a wife who was reorganizing the closet for spring. I almost let it go. I actually stood there in the hallway, one hand on the closet door, telling myself exactly that story, because it's a comfortable story, and I am, when it counts, capable of being just as willing to look away as anybody else. But old habits are old habits. I noticed the dust pattern on the shelf where the folder should have been, a rectangle slightly cleaner than the wood around it, meaning something had been sitting there recently and had only just been removed, not weeks ago during some spring cleaning, but days ago, maybe less. I didn't say anything to Diane. I want to be honest about why, because it's not flattering. Part of me was afraid of what I'd find if I asked. A man who spends 35 years catching other people's lies develops a very particular kind of cowardice about the ones closest to him, as if not looking is the same thing as nothing being wrong. 3 days later, Priya called. I need to tell you about Priya properly, because nothing that happens later makes sense without her. 18 years ago, when she was 24 and fresh out of a forensic examiner training program, a senior partner at my old firm tried to have her fired over a signature analysis she'd gotten right and he'd gotten wrong, purely so his own error wouldn't show up in the file. I was the only person in that firm who backed her up in writing, put my own name on the line for a junior analyst nobody was required to protect. She kept her job. She went on to build a career at First Meridian's internal fraud division, and every year since, right around the holidays, she sends a card that just says, "Thank you for believing me when it cost you something." That's not a debt I ever expected repaid. But debts like that have a way of coming due exactly when you need them most, whether you ever asked for it or not. "Walter," she said, when I picked up the phone that Tuesday afternoon, "I need you to tell me I'm wrong about something, and I need you to tell me fast." She'd been reviewing a batch of home equity line applications flagged for a routine quarterly audit. Nothing unusual, just standard due diligence on high-value accounts, when one file stopped her cold. My name was on it. My signature, authorizing $140,000 drawn against our house, the house Diane and I had spent 11 years of weekends paying off early specifically, so no bank would ever hold a lien over us again. "Walter, I've looked at your signature file for 18 years, Priya said, and I could hear something careful and frightened underneath her professional calm. "I know your hand. This isn't your hand. It's close. Whoever did this studied you. But the pressure changeover on the G is wrong, and there's a hesitation before the last stroke of the W that you never have, not once in 18 years of exemplars. I need you to tell me you signed this, because if you didn't, this is fraud against a federally chartered lender, and it's already been processed." I sat down on the edge of my bed and I looked at the scan she emailed over while we were still on the phone, and every single instinct I had spent 35 years training told me the same thing at once. That was not my signature. But I want you to understand something about how a lifetime of expertise actually behaves in the moment it matters most. Because it isn't clean and it isn't fast. I didn't feel triumphant at having caught something. I felt the floor of my own house tilt sideways underneath me because the only two people who had access to that lockbox, who knew the exact address of that property, who could have supplied the notary with a driver's license and an address and every small true detail a convincing forgery needs, were myself and my wife of 31 years. Don't do anything yet, Priya said. Don't confront anyone. Let me pull the full file first, the notary log, the disbursement records, everything, through the proper channels, so if this is what it looks like, we have it clean and we have it legal. I can lose my job doing this wrong, Walter. Give me 1 week. I remember thinking, sitting there with the phone still warm against my ear, that a week was nothing. A week was the blink of an eye against 31 years. I was wrong about that too, but not in the direction I expected. That night at dinner, Diane talked about caterers for the anniversary party, about whether we should do the seafood tower or keep it simple, and I sat across from her at the same oak table we'd bought secondhand the year Marcus was born, and I watched her hands while she talked. The same hands I'd held at our wedding, the same hands that used to trace absent little circles on my shoulder when I couldn't sleep after a hard case, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I didn't have a word for yet. I want to tell you I confronted her right then. I didn't. Instead, I did something that, looking back, was the exact moment I stopped being a passive man waiting to find out how bad this was, and became something else entirely. I got up, cleared the plates like it was any other Tuesday, and I went out to the garage, to the workbench, where I'd been slowly restoring my father's old watchmaking tools, and I opened the drawer where I kept the one thing of his I'd never shown Diane, not once in 31 years of marriage, because it had always felt like it belonged only to me and him, the letter Henrik Graves wrote it the year before he died, and never sent it, and I found it folded into quarters at the bottom of his tool chest, tucked beneath a felt-lined tray of watch springs he never got to use. It isn't long. My father wasn't a man of many words on paper any more than he was in person, but I want to read you the part that matters, because I read it again that night in the garage with my hands shaking worse than they'd shaken in months, and it steadied something in me that I didn't know still needed steadying. He wrote, "Walter, you are always better at seeing what's wrong than what's right in front of you. Don't let that turn into a habit of catching everyone, but the people closest to you. A man who spends his life looking for the lie owes it to the people he loves to actually look at them, not just past them. I hadn't understood that letter when I was 26 and grieving. I understood it perfectly at 63, sitting on a metal stool in my garage with a forged signature sitting in my email inbox and my wife humming to herself in the kitchen 30 feet away, utterly unaware that the man she thought was too old to notice anything had just started noticing everything. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Diane in the dark, listening to her breathe, cataloging, because that's what 35 years trains you to do whether you want it to or not. Every small strangeness of the past 2 years that I had let myself explain away. The new personal trainer she'd hired 18 months ago, a man named Ray Doyle, who, it turned out when I actually looked him up that night on my phone under the covers, wasn't a personal trainer at all, but a certified financial planner running his own boutique practice out of an office, 2 floors below a gym. Diane happened to attend 3 mornings a week. The financial literacy seminars she'd started attending on Thursday evenings, seminars I'd never once been invited to. For a wife, I'd always handled the household finances alongside as equal partners for 3 decades. The way she'd started keeping her phone face down on every surface in the house, a small habit that had crept in, so gradually I'd stopped registering it as anything at all. By 4 in the morning, I had a name, a face from a professional headshot on a slick little website promising wealth strategies for the next chapter of your life, and a hollow, furious clarity that felt less like anger and more like the specific, cold precision I used to feel walking into a courtroom knowing I had already won. Ray Doyle, 38 years old, licensed financial advisor, and, according to the State Disciplinary Board's public record, which I found at 4:15 in the morning with my reading glasses pushed up on my forehead and my hands finally steady, for the first time in weeks. A man who had been quietly reprimanded 3 years earlier by his previous firm for concerns regarding client fund handling, a complaint that had been settled, sealed, and buried before it ever reached the level of a formal investigation. I want to be careful here, because I promised myself I would be, all the way through this. I didn't yet know everything. I didn't know about Corinne. I didn't know how deep the forgery went, or that Ray Doyle had done this before, to other men exactly my age, in exactly this way, more than once. I didn't know that my own son had, for reasons I still find difficult to talk about, already known something was wrong for months and said nothing. All I knew, lying in the dark next to a woman I had loved for 31 years, was that somebody had studied my handwriting closely enough to almost fool a federal bank examiner, and that the same hand that used to trace circles on my shoulder had very likely handed that forger every single true detail he needed to do it. The next morning, I called an old friend. His name is Desmond Achibi, and 41 years ago, when I was a 22-year-old apprentice examiner too broke to afford a decent used car, Desmond's father ran a small private investigation firm out of a converted row house, 3 blocks from mine, and he took me on as an unpaid research assistant purely because his son and I had grown up on the same street, playing stickball against the same brick wall. I paid that kindness forward for decades, testified pro bono in 2 of Desmond's toughest custody cases, taught his daughter document analysis basics when she wanted to follow her father into the trade. Desmond runs that same firm now, grayer than me, sharper than ever, and when I called him at 6:30 that morning and told him I needed a full, quiet, completely legal financial and background workup on a man named Ray Doyle, he didn't ask me a single unnecessary question. "How fast do you need it?" he said. "Before the anniversary party," I told him. 11 days. That's tight for clean work. I don't want fast and dirty, Des. I want fast and true. If we're going to do this, we do it in a way that holds up, because I am not going to hand that man or my wife a single technicality to hide behind. There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause between 2 old men who understand each other without needing the whole sentence spoken aloud. "You sound like your father," Desmond said finally. "He used to say the same thing about locks. Anybody can break one open. The trick is opening it clean enough that nobody can even prove you were ever inside." I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table in the gray early light of a house I had spent 11 years paying down early. And I made myself a promise that I intend to keep for the rest of this story. I was not going to become the kind of man who destroys things out of rage. I had spent 35 years of my life being the person a courtroom trusted to find the truth and lay it out clean, undeniable, impossible to argue with. Whatever Diane and Ray Doyle had built together in the dark, I was going to take it apart in exactly the same way, one true, provable detail at a time, and I was going to do it standing in the light, in front of everyone who mattered, on a night they thought was going to be a celebration. They had 50 years of history to answer for. I intended to give them 11 days to try. That afternoon, Diane came home from her Thursday seminar, glowing in a way she hadn't glowed at me in longer than I wanted to admit, and she kissed my cheek and asked what I wanted to do for dinner, and I looked at this woman I had built an entire life alongside, and I said, "Whatever you'd like, honey," and for the first time in 31 years of marriage, I meant something almost entirely different than what the words seemed to say. Because for once, I wasn't the old man who couldn't see it anymore. I was only just beginning to look. Ga 1 de Tiptuk Lurt 2-1. Orchestrated seamless script continuation within word parameters. Orchestrated seamless script continuation within word parameters. Desmond's first report came in on a Sunday evening, 4 days after that phone call, delivered the way he always delivered sensitive material, not by email, never by email, but in person, over decaf coffee at the same diner on Route 9 where his father used to meet informants back when informants still wore trench coats and meant it unironically. Desmond had aged into the kind of man who looked more comfortable in a diner booth than he ever had in an office, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, still built like the linebacker he'd been in high school 40 years ago, and he slid a manila folder across the table to me without a word, which was his way of telling me it was worse than either of us had hoped. "Before you open that," he said, "I want you to understand something. I've done this kind of workup for 30 years. cheating spouses, embezzling business partners, the occasional runaway teenager. I know what garden variety betrayal looks like on paper. This isn't that. I opened the folder. Ray Doyle had been licensed as a financial advisor for 11 years, and in that time he had worked for 4 different firms, never staying anywhere longer than 3 years, always leaving under circumstances that were described in the official record as mutual, and described in the much longer unofficial record Desmond had assembled through 2 former colleagues willing to talk off record as considerably less mutual than that. At his second firm, an elderly widower named Harold Pemberton had granted Ray power of attorney over a modest retirement account 8 months into what Pemberton's daughter later described, in a complaint she filed with the State Board, as an inappropriately close personal relationship between her 71-year-old father and his 30-year-old financial advisor. The account had lost 40% of its value in high-risk relocations before the daughter intervened. No charges were filed. The daughter's complaint was quietly settled with a partial reimbursement and a non-disclosure clause, the same pattern I would come to recognize over the following days as Ray Doyle's signature move as clearly as any pen stroke I'd ever analyzed under a loupe. "There's a pattern here," Desmond said, tapping the folder. "Older men. Men his client's age, not his own. Men with paid-off houses, modest but real assets, and, this is the part that matters, Walter, men whose wives Ray gets close to first, every single time. He doesn't seduce the target. He seduces the gatekeeper." I want to be honest about how that sentence landed in me, because it reframed everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. I had spent 4 days assuming Diane was the victim of her own poor judgment, a woman of 59, who'd been flattered by a younger man's attention into doing something foolish. What Desmond was telling me, gently, the way you tell an old friend something you know is going to hurt, was that Diane might not have been a victim of anything. She might have been recruited. "I'm not saying that's what happened here," Desmond added, watching my face carefully. "I'm saying it's the pattern, and you need to know the pattern before you decide what you think you're looking at." The second thing in that folder was the one that made my hands go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the tremor. Ray Doyle's current employer of record was a boutique wealth management practice called Ashford Legacy Partners, a 2-person outfit operating out of a modest but well-appointed suite, 2 floors below the gym where Diane had, 18 months earlier, supposedly hired him as a personal trainer. The practice's founder and sole principal, according to public filings, was a woman named Corinne Ashford, 61 years old, a former compliance officer at a major regional bank who had left that career 14 years ago to open her own advisory practice. Desmond had pulled Corinne Ashford's public records, too, and what he found was this: 3 separate former clients, all men between the ages of 60 and 70, all with a documented close personal advisory relationship with either Ray Doyle or one of 2 other young advisors Corinne had employed and subsequently let go over the past decade, all of whom had, at some point during that relationship, executed significant changes to estate documents, trust beneficiaries, or property titles that benefited either the advisor directly or entities Corinne Ashford's firm had helped establish. None of it had ever risen to the level of criminal prosecution. Every complaint had been settled quietly, every non-disclosure signed, every family too embarrassed or too exhausted or too afraid of what a public fight would do to an aging father's reputation to push further than a settlement check. "This isn't Ray Doyle running a con on your wife," Desmond said quietly. "This is Corinne Ashford running a business. Ray's just the front of house." I sat in that diner booth for a long time without saying anything, and Desmond, God bless him, let me sit there, the way a man does when he understands that some silences aren't meant to be filled. "Here's what I need you to understand about what happened in me during that silence, because it's the hinge point of everything that came after." I had spent 4 days quietly furious at my wife, cataloging her small deceptions the same clinical way I used to catalog the pressure variance in a forged signature, treating the whole unfolding disaster as a document to be authenticated. Genuine betrayal or misunderstanding, real forgery or coincidence. Sitting in that booth, I finally let myself feel the actual shape of what was happening. And it wasn't fury. It was grief, plain and enormous, for a woman I still loved, who might have walked willingly into being used as a tool against her own husband, and I did not yet know which was true. That she'd been seduced into complicity, or recruited into it, or something in between that had no clean name at all. I need everything you can get me on the trust amendment, I told Desmond, because thinking about the mechanics was the only thing keeping my hand steady on the table. If Diane's power of attorney over the house account was forged, there has to be a paper trail showing how they got a notary to process it. Priya's already 3 steps ahead of you there, Desmond said. She called me yesterday. Professional courtesy, one investigator to another. She's found the notary. The notary's name was Gregory Feld, a semi-retired mobile notary who ran a small side business processing documents for busy professionals unable to make it into a bank branch during business hours. The kind of convenient, slightly too accommodating service that exists precisely to be exploited by people who know exactly what they're doing. Priya's internal audit had turned up 2 other loan applications Feld had notarized over the past 3 years, bearing the hallmarks of the same forgery pattern, both connected through a chain of shell addresses and forwarding services back to Ray Doyle's client list. Feld himself, it turned out, was not a co-conspirator. He was, according to the notary log Priya had pulled through proper legal channels, simply careless, the kind of man who verified identification with a glance and a rubber stamp rather than the scrutiny his license required, easily fooled by a woman who arrived alone, calm, confident, carrying what looked like every document a spouse might reasonably be expected to carry, including, and this detail nearly stopped my heart when Priya read it to me over the phone 2 days later, an expired passport of mine that Diane must have quietly held onto after we'd renewed our current ones, because it carried my old signature, the one from 12 years ago, close enough to the current one that a busy notary wouldn't think twice, but different enough that it explained exactly the small inconsistencies that had caught Priya's trained eye in the first place. She had used an old passport of mine to build the forgery. She had gone into our own fireproof lockbox, taken a document that legally belonged in our shared archive of a shared life, and handed it to a man being paid to erase me from my own house. I didn't tell Diane any of this. Not yet. There were still 6 days until the anniversary party, and I had promised myself I would do this clean, do it true, do it in a way that left no room for anyone to later claim I'd acted out of paranoia or spite. So instead of confronting her, I did something that, looking back, cost me more than almost anything else in this entire story, and it's the part I'm least proud of, and the part my father's letter had warned me about most directly. I kept looking past the people right in front of me instead of at them. My daughter Emily called me on the Tuesday before the party, 4 days out, just to check in about seating arrangements, and something in my voice must have given me away, because she went quiet on the other end of the line and then said, carefully, "Dad, is everything okay with you and Mom?" I told her everything was fine. I have thought about that lie more times than almost any other moment in this entire ordeal, because Emily, my sharp, watchful daughter who inherited exactly none of my patience and all of my stubbornness, was trying to hand me an opening, and I closed it because I still believed, foolishly, that I could handle this alone, the same way I'd handled every difficult case in 35 years of practice, quietly, competently, without ever letting anyone see the moment where my own hands started shaking. Marcus was harder. My son had been distant with me for the better part of 8 months by that point. A distance I'd chalked up to the ordinary friction of a 32-year-old man renegotiating his relationship with his aging father. The kind of thing I told myself was normal, natural, nothing to dig into. I called him that same Tuesday night, ostensibly to confirm his flight details for the party, and there was something in the too careful way he answered my questions, the way he changed the subject twice when I mentioned Diane's new seminars, that finally made me stop and actually listen to my own son instead of past him. "Marcus," I said, "is there something you need to tell me?" The silence on the line lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Dad, I don't." He stopped, started again. "I saw Mom having dinner with a guy a few months ago. at that Italian place on 4th Street. I figured it was a work thing at first, but they were sitting really close, and when I walked past their table, she looked at me like she wanted me to keep walking. So I did. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't say anything to you. I told myself it wasn't my business, and then enough time passed that saying something felt worse than not saying anything, and I let it go, Dad. I'm sorry. I should have told you months ago. I want to be honest with you about what that confession did to me, because it wasn't the anger you might expect. It was recognition. My own son, watching something he knew was wrong, choosing silence because confronting it felt harder than living with it. I understood that particular cowardice better than I wanted to, because I had been quietly practicing a version of it myself for years, ever since I hid a shaking hand from my own wife, rather than risk what looking honestly at my own decline might cost me. You should have, I told him, and I let that sentence sit there without softening it, because he needed to hear it plainly, and because I needed to say it out loud to someone, even if the someone who most needed to hear it was myself. But I understand why you didn't. I've been doing something very similar for longer than I want to admit. That confession, mine, not his, is the only time in this entire story I will ask you to remember that I was not a perfect man walking into this fight. I had let my pride keep me from telling my wife I was afraid of what my failing hands meant for the rest of my life. I had let my instinct to protect people from difficult truths keep me from asking my own children direct questions I already half suspected the answers to. Whatever justice I eventually built, I built it standing on the same ordinary human failures everyone in this story was guilty of in their own way, mine included, but recognizing a failure and repeating it are two different choices. And from that phone call forward, I stopped making the second one. I asked Marcus to come to the house 2 days early, before the rest of the family arrived for the party, and for the first time in longer than either of us could probably name, my son and I sat across from each other at that same oak kitchen table and actually talked. Not about football, not about his job, not about anything easy, about his mother, about Ray Doyle, about the specific shape of the silence we'd both been keeping. It was Marcus, in fact, who told me the detail that finally made every piece of Corinne Ashford's operation click into place. "There's something else," he said, turning his coffee mug slowly on the table without drinking from it. "About 3 weeks ago I stopped by unannounced, thought I'd surprise Mom, bring her lunch. She wasn't home, but her laptop was open on the kitchen counter, still logged into her email. I wasn't snooping, Dad, I swear, it was just right there on the screen. There was a message open from someone named Corinne. It said, I remember it exactly because it bothered me so much. It said, once Walter's declared unable to manage his own affairs, the amendment becomes uncontestable. We just need one more documented incident. I sat very still. Declared unable to manage his own affairs. Not a phrase you stumble into by accident. A phrase with a specific, deliberate legal weight, the exact language used in guardianship and conservatorship petitions, the mechanism by which a court can strip a person, usually an elderly one, of the legal authority to manage their own money, their own property, their own life, if a judge can be convinced that person is no longer competent to do so. They weren't just trying to steal money out from under me through forged documents. Forgery is a crime you can be caught committing once, and then it's over. What Corinne Ashford was building, with Ray Doyle as the instrument and my own wife as, at minimum, a willing participant, was something far more permanent, a legal case assembled patiently over months, designed to convince a court that Walter Graves, 63 years old, was no longer capable of managing his own affairs at all. One more documented incident. They needed one more piece of evidence, a lapse, an outburst, a moment of visible confusion or instability, and they would have everything required to petition for a conservatorship that would hand total legal control of my finances, my house, and quite possibly my remaining independence to my wife, guided every step of the way by a woman who had built an entire quiet business out of doing exactly this to men my age. That was when I understood, finally, completely, the true shape of the insult Diane had aimed at me across that anniversary table, days later, the one that opens this whole story. You're an old man who spent his whole life squinting at other people's handwriting, and you still didn't see this one coming. It wasn't a cruel remark thrown out in a moment of panic. It was a test. She was watching to see whether I would react the way a man losing his grip on reality might react. Loudly, irrationally, in front of witnesses on tape, in a room full of people who could later testify, if it came to that Walter Graves had a public breakdown at his own 50th anniversary party. I did not know that yet. Sitting at my kitchen table with my son 2 days before the party, I only knew that the ground beneath this entire situation had just shifted from betrayal into something with real legal teeth, something with a documented paper trail and a named, deliberate architect, and that I had roughly 48 hours to finish building a case, airtight enough to survive whatever they intended to throw at me in that banquet room. I need you on my side for this, Marcus, I said. Not against your mother, I don't want to destroy her. But I am not going to let her hand my life over to people who have done this to other families before ours, and I need to know, right now, whether you're willing to help me stop it. My son looked at me across that table for a long moment, and something in his face shifted. The particular hardening you see in a person choosing, finally, after months of comfortable silence, to actually stand somewhere. I should have said something the day I saw them at that restaurant, he said. I'm not making that mistake twice. Tell me what you need. What I needed, as it turned out, fit inside three things: the forged document itself, physical, undeniable, ready to be placed in front of witnesses; Priya's completed audit trail, showing exactly how and when the forgery had been processed; and one more piece. The piece I hadn't found yet, the piece that would end up being the most human and least legal of everything in this entire case. Because documents convince a courtroom, but they rarely break a room full of family and friends the way a single true physical object can. I found that piece the following morning, the day before the party, in the bottom drawer of my father's old tool chest, in the same spot where I'd found his letter 37 years earlier, folded beneath the felt tray of watch springs, where it had apparently sat undisturbed since the day I first discovered the letter itself, was something I had somehow never noticed before, tucked into a small cracked leather pouch stitched by hand. My father's wedding ring, the one he'd stopped wearing in his final years, once his hands grew too thin and arthritic to keep it on safely. And beside it, wrapped in a scrap of the same felt, a second letter, this one addressed not to me but to whoever, someday, might need it. My mother had died 3 years before my father did, and in that second letter, written in the same careful, deliberate hand as the first, my father had put down in plain words what 51 years of marriage to her had actually meant to him. Not the polished public version he told at dinner parties, but the real one, including the 2 years in the middle of their marriage when things had nearly ended, when trust had nearly broken past repairing, and how they had found their way back to each other anyway, slowly, honestly. One difficult, true conversation at a time. I sat in that garage for a long while, holding both letters and that small worn ring, and I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected, exactly what I needed to say to Diane, and exactly what I needed everyone else in that banquet room to understand. Before this was over, the party was in 26 hours. Ray Doyle and Corinne Ashford believed they were 26 hours away from either a quiet financial victory or one final documented incident that would hand them the rest. They had no idea that the man they decided was too old to see any of it coming had spent the last week doing exactly what he'd spent 35 years training to do, reading every small true detail nobody else had bothered to look at closely enough, and building patiently, cleanly, undeniably, the case that was about to end them. The morning of the party, I woke before dawn the way I used to on the days I had to testify in a courtroom that mattered. That particular quiet alertness that comes from knowing exactly what you're walking into and exactly what you refuse to leave without. Diane was still asleep beside me, and I lay there for a long moment just watching her breathe, feeling the strange double weight of 31 years of real love sitting right next to whatever this last year had actually been. I want to be honest and tell you I still didn't know, even then, exactly how much of Diane's heart had been in this, and how much of her had simply been managed, guided, worked on by two people who had made an entire quiet career out of doing precisely that to people like her. I would find out that night. Everyone would. Desmond arrived at 7 with the final version of the file. Everything organized now into a single leather folio, each document tabbed, each piece of evidence sourced through channels, clean enough that no attorney on earth could later claim it had been obtained improperly. Priya had submitted her formal fraud report to First Meridian's internal legal department the day before, which meant that by the time the sun came up on my 50th wedding anniversary, the bank itself had already opened a case file with my name on it as the victim, not the subject, of a documented forgery, a detail that would matter enormously later, because it meant everything I was about to do that night wasn't some private act of a bitter husband. It was already, on paper, exactly what it was. The response of a wronged man to a documented crime, moving through channels a court would respect completely. "You don't have to do this at the party," Desmond told me one last time, standing in my driveway with his hand on my shoulder. "You could hand this whole file to a lawyer Monday morning and let the system grind it out over the next 18 months. I could, I agreed. But Corinne Ashford's whole business model depends on families being too embarrassed to fight this in public. Every single one of her victims signed a quiet settlement and disappeared into silence rather than let anyone see what happened to them. I'm 63 years old, Des. I spent 35 years teaching juries how to see the truth in a piece of paper. I am done being quiet about anything." Emily arrived at noon with her husband and my 7-year-old granddaughter, Lucy, and watching Lucy run through the house in her small blue party dress, utterly unaware of anything except the promise of cake. Later that evening steadied something in me that all the documents in Desmond's folio hadn't quite managed to. Whatever else happened tonight, I was doing this so that a little girl could grow up believing that when someone tries to take everything from the people who love her, the answer is to stand up in the light and fight for it. Honestly, not to disappear into a quiet settlement out of shame. The banquet hall Diane had chosen months earlier, back when I still believed every part of this celebration was exactly what it appeared to be, was the same restored ballroom where we'd actually held our wedding reception 50 years before. Her choice, deliberately sentimental, and I remember being almost angry, walking in that afternoon to check the room setup, at how effective that sentimentality was even now, even knowing everything I knew. 40 guests, string quartet, white linen, candles shaped like the numbers 5 and 0, a slideshow of 50 years of photographs looping quietly on a screen near the head table. My whole life projected in soft light onto a wall, while the woman who had shared most of it with me sat 3 tables away, laughing at something Ray Doyle, seated with the other advisors and family friends, at what Diane had described to me weeks earlier as simply a colleague I invited, said to make her smile. I watched them together for a while that evening, before anyone had eaten, before any toasts had been given, and I confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't let myself fully feel until I saw it with my own eyes in that room, the easy, practiced closeness between them, the kind that doesn't develop over 18 months of gym sessions and financial seminars unless both people have been actively building it. Whatever Diane's heart had or hadn't fully been in, she was not an unwilling participant tonight. She had invited the man actively working to strip her husband of his legal independence to celebrate that same husband's 50th wedding anniversary, and she had done it without so much as a flicker of hesitation. That was the last piece of proof I needed, if I'm honest, not for the courts. For myself, dinner passed in a blur I mostly don't remember, the way stressful, important nights often do. Fragments of conversation. My brother-in-law's terrible joke about 50 years of marriage being a life sentence. Lucy sliding under the table to retrieve a dropped fork and refusing to come back out until someone promised her extra cake. I kept the leather folio in a locked case beneath my chair the entire meal, and every few minutes I found my hand drifting to check it was still there, the way a man checks his pocket for keys he's terrified of losing. The toasts began around 8:30. Marcus went first, then Emily, both of them warm and funny and careful, in a way I only understood in hindsight. to avoid saying anything that sounded too much like a eulogy for a marriage that might not survive the night. Then it was Diane's turn, and she stood, glass in hand, and gave a toast so polished, so warmly delivered, so full of small true details about our life together, the courthouse where we met, the year we almost lost the house before I picked up weekend work, the way I used to leave her little handwritten notes tucked into her coat pockets before long work trips, that for one terrible moment I felt my own resolve waver. Because how could a woman who remembered all of that, who spoke about it with what sounded like genuine tenderness, actually be capable of what I now knew she'd done? And then she said it. The line that opens this whole story. She'd been building towards some larger point about growing older together, about how love changes shape over 50 years, and something in her tone shifted, just slightly. Just enough for me to recognize the sound of a rehearsed provocation rather than a genuine remark. And she looked directly at me, in front of all 40 guests, in front of our children, in front of Ray Doyle sitting 3 tables away with an expression I would later understand was pure professional anticipation. And she said it. "You're an old man who spent his whole life squinting at other people's handwriting, Walter, and you still didn't see this one coming." The room went silent in the particular, total way. Rooms only go silent when something has gone genuinely, visibly wrong. No polite laughter, no one quite sure whether to smile. The string quartet still playing softly somewhere behind us, because none of the musicians had any idea what had just happened. A candle guttering slightly near the head table, and not one single fork moving anywhere in that entire hall. Emily's hand froze over her water glass. Marcus stared down at the tablecloth. I sat there in my good navy sweater holding the small velvet box I'd been saving for my own toast, and for exactly 3 seconds, I let myself feel every bit of the humiliation she clearly intended that line to produce, because she needed a reaction, needed something raw and public, and just unstable enough to serve as her one more documented incident. And I understood with total clarity that this entire toast had been engineered specifically to provoke it. I did not give it to her. I set the velvet box down gently on the white tablecloth, stood up slowly, and I reached under my chair for the locked case that had been sitting there through the entire dinner. "You're right about one thing, Diane," I said. And I kept my voice level, quiet, the exact register I used to use walking a jury through a piece of forged evidence, because rage was exactly what this room had been built to provoke out of me, and I refused to hand it to them. I did spend 35 years learning to see what other people miss in a signature, and about 3 weeks ago, an old colleague of mine found my name on a document authorizing $140,000 against this house, a signature I never wrote. Somewhere behind Diane, I watched Ray Doyle's face change, the practiced pleasantness sliding off it in real time, replaced by something colder and far more alert. "Walter, this isn't the place." Diane started, but her voice had lost the confident, rehearsed edge from 30 seconds earlier. "You're right, it isn't," I agreed. "It's the place you chose, though. You chose this room, this night, 50 guests, our whole family, to say what you just said to me. So I'm going to finish what you started." I opened the case and set the folio on the table, not opening it fully, not yet, because I'd promised myself I would only reveal what Desmond and Priya and our lawyer had already confirmed, through completely proper channels, was safe and legal to say out loud in front of a room full of witnesses. The forged document itself, verified fraud, already under formal review by a federally chartered bank, already a matter of documented record rather than private accusation, that I could hold up, that everyone in this room had every right to see. 11 days ago, I said, a document examiner at First Meridian Bank flagged a home equity application bearing my forged signature. It's already been reported to the bank's internal fraud division, and, as of yesterday morning, to the county prosecutor's office as well. I'm not telling you this tonight to humiliate anyone. I'm telling you because you just stood in front of my entire family and suggested, in front of witnesses, that I'm too old to notice what's happening around me, and I think everyone in this room deserves to know exactly how wrong that is. I heard my own father's voice in the back of my mind then, the letter I'd read 100 times over the past 2 weeks, A man who spends his life looking for the lie owes it to the people he loves to actually look at them, not just past them. I had spent this entire ordeal terrified of what it would cost me to finally look directly at my wife instead of around her. Standing in that room, folio open on the table, I understood that the cost of looking away had always been higher. Ray Doyle stood up from his table, 3 seats over, his chair scraping loud against the floor in the dead silence. "This is a private family matter," he said, and his voice had the smooth, practiced calm of a man used to talking frightened people down from difficult conversations. "I don't think it's appropriate for me to be here for it." "Sit down, Ray," I said, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than either of us expected, because he did. "You're the reason we're having it in the first place. You've been my wife's financial advisor for 18 months. Before that, you were Harold Pemberton's financial advisor for 2 years, until his daughter filed a complaint with the state board over a power of attorney you never should have accepted. Before that, 2 other men your firm never talks about publicly. I have all of it, Ray. Every settlement, every non-disclosure, every quiet arrangement your employer negotiated to keep men like me from ever standing in a room like this one and saying what I'm about to say." I looked past him then, to the far side of the room, where a woman I had never met in person, but recognized instantly from Desmond's file photographs, sat quietly at a table near the back. Corinne Ashford, 61 years old, silver hair pulled back severely, dressed in the kind of understated elegant gray that photographs beautifully and disappears completely into a crowd. Exactly the way a woman running a decade-long quiet operation targeting men my age would want to disappear. "You brought your own boss to my anniversary party, Diane," I said quietly. I imagine that felt safer than coming alone. The look on Diane's face in that moment is one I will carry for the rest of my life. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the specific dawning horror of a person realizing in real time in front of everyone she loves that the man she had decided was too diminished to be a threat had spent the last 2 weeks building a case with more precision and patience than she had ever seen him bring to anything in 31 years of marriage. "Walter," she said, her voice cracking, "please, can we discuss this privately?" "You didn't offer me privacy," I said. "You offered me a room full of witnesses and a rehearsed insult designed to make me look unstable in front of them. I'm simply finishing the conversation you started." And that was when Corinne Ashford, watching her carefully built operation begin to unravel in real time in front of 40 witnesses, made the single mistake that would end up costing her everything else that night. Because a woman who has spent a decade succeeding by keeping every one of her victims silent and ashamed had never once had to face a room where the target refused to be either. Corinne Ashford stood up from the back table, and for the first time all evening she abandoned the careful, camera-ready composure Desmond's file photographs had captured so consistently over a decade of quiet business. Because a woman who has spent 10 years succeeding by keeping every target isolated and ashamed had clearly never once rehearsed for a room that refused to look away. "Mr. Graves," she said, walking forward with the brisk, managerial calm of someone accustomed to smoothing over other people's messes, "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here, and I'd be more than happy to sit down with you and your attorney privately to resolve." "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "Harold Pemberton's daughter didn't misunderstand what happened to her father's retirement account. Neither did the other 2 families your firm quietly settled with over the past decade. I have their names, Ms. Ashford. I have the settlement dates. I have the non-disclosure agreements your attorney drafted, because it turns out non-disclosure agreements don't actually stop a private investigator from confirming a document exists, only from confirming what's inside it. And once a county prosecutor's office has probable cause to open its own investigation, which as of yesterday morning it does, sealed settlements have a way of becoming considerably less sealed." I watched something crack across Corinne Ashford's face, a flicker of genuine alarm breaking through the professional mask, and she turned toward Ray Doyle with an expression that told me, more clearly than anything in Desmond's file ever could, exactly how this partnership actually worked underneath its polished surface. "Ray," she said, low and sharp, How many accounts have you actually processed under Ashford Legacy this quarter? It was such a strange, specific question to ask in the middle of a public confrontation that it took me a moment to understand why she was asking it. And Ray Doyle's face, when I finally looked at him closely, told me everything before he said a single word. He looked less like a man caught in an affair, and more like a man who had just watched a completely separate trapdoor open beneath his feet. Corinne, now isn't. How many, Ray? It came out later, in the county prosecutor's formal filing, 3 weeks after that night. But I'll tell you now because it's the piece that finally made sense of the strange, brittle partnership I'd watched across that room all evening. Ray Doyle had not been faithfully executing Corinne Ashford's decade-long scheme as her loyal instrument. He had been running his own parallel skim on top of it for the past 2 years, diverting a percentage of every fraudulent transfer into accounts Corinne knew nothing about, quietly building an exit fund of his own, for the day he decided he no longer needed her firm's cover at all. My $140,000, it turned out, had never been fully destined for either of them jointly. Ray Doyle had structured the forged home equity draw to route through an intermediary account he controlled alone, meaning that whatever Corinne Ashford believed she and Diane were building together towards some eventual conservatorship payday, Ray had already quietly begun cutting both of them out. The mastermind, it turned out, had been played by her own instrument the entire time, and watching that realization land across Corinne Ashford's face in real time in front of 40 witnesses was the single strangest and most satisfying thing I have ever watched happen at a family party. "You've been skimming my own operation," Corinne said, quiet and furious, and I don't think she even remembered, for a moment, that we were all still standing there watching. "Everyone in this room can hear you," I said, and I said it gently, because I no longer needed to raise my voice. The two of them were finishing this for me now, in public, exactly the way 10 years of careful settlements and buried complaints had never allowed a single one of their other victims to witness. That was the moment my wife's older sister, Margaret, stood up. I want to tell you about Margaret, honestly, because she and I have never been particularly close in 31 years of marriage, a polite holiday dinner kind of closeness, nothing deeper. She had, if anything, always been more Diane's ally than mine in the small disagreements every long marriage accumulates. Which is exactly why what happened next mattered as much as it did, Diane. Margaret's voice cut across the room, sharp enough that even Corinne and Ray went quiet. "I sat at your kitchen table 4 months ago, and you told me Ray was helping you get your finances organized before retirement. I believed you. I have believed every single thing you've told me for 59 years, because you're my baby sister and I love you." She turned, and I watched her look, for the first time all night, directly at me. "But I have known Walter Graves since before either of you were married. I have watched that man co-sign a loan for our father without ever once mentioning it at a single family loan for 20 years. Because he wasn't interested in credit, only in helping. I have watched him teach my own daughter how to read a forged check so she wouldn't get taken advantage of the way I almost was in my 20s. Whatever is happening here tonight, I am not going to sit at this table and pretend I don't see exactly which one of you has spent this marriage giving, and which one of you just stood up in front of his entire family and called him too old to notice his own life being taken from him." She hadn't planned that. I could tell by the way her hands were shaking slightly against the tablecloth when she finished, the way her voice wavered on the word baby sister. This wasn't rehearsed the way Diane's toast had been. It was a woman choosing, in real time, in the middle of a room she had no obligation to take a side in, to actually take one. Diane sat down slowly in her chair, and for the first time all evening, the confident, rehearsed composure that had carried her through that opening insult was simply gone. I need to tell you what happened next carefully, because it's the part of this story that matters most, and it isn't the part with the villains in it. I closed the folio. I hadn't opened it fully at any point that evening. Everything I'd said had come from memory, from a case I'd spent 11 days building precisely, so I would never need to read anyone's private financial ruin aloud to a room like this one. The prosecutor's office would handle the rest through proper channels. Starting Monday morning, Priya's formal fraud report was already filed. Desmond's investigation was already documented and legal. Whatever happened to Ray Doyle and Corinne Ashford from this point forward belonged to the system I had spent 35 years of my career, trusting to work, slowly, correctly, without my needing to be the one to deliver the final blow myself. What I still had to do belonged only to my family. I want everyone to sit back down, I said, except the two of you. I looked at Ray and Corinne. I think you both have somewhere else to be. They left. Nobody in that room stopped them, and nobody needed to, because the county prosecutor's investigator Desmond had quietly coordinated with was waiting in the parking lot with two uniformed officers, not to arrest anyone that night. The paperwork wasn't ready for that yet, but to formally serve both of them with notice that they were now the named subjects of an active fraud investigation, the kind of notice that ends careers and freezes assets and starts the long, unglamorous, entirely legal process that would, over the following 8 months, result in Ray Doyle's license being permanently revoked by the state board and a criminal fraud conviction that would put him on probation for 3 years, with full restitution ordered to every family he'd targeted, including 2 others who came forward once the story became public. Families who had signed their own quiet settlements years earlier and never told anyone what had actually happened to them until they saw that someone else had finally refused to stay silent. Corinne Ashford's firm was shut down within the month, her license suspended pending investigation, and though the prosecutor's case against her personally never rose to full criminal conviction, she was careful. In the end, in a way Ray never quite managed to be, the public record of the investigation itself was enough. Nobody in this town hired Ashford Legacy Partners for anything ever again. But that's the part of this story that belongs to lawyers and courtrooms, and I promised myself a long time ago that I wasn't going to let this account become just another catalog of legal proceedings. Because the truth is, the part that actually mattered to me happened in that banquet hall about 20 minutes after Ray and Corinne walked out the door. Once the initial shock had settled into something quieter, Deanne was still sitting at our table, alone now, staring down at her hands, and Marcus had moved to sit beside her, not because he'd forgiven her yet. I don't think he had, not fully, not that night, but because she was still his mother, and some loyalties don't disappear just because they get complicated. I sat down across from my wife of 31 years, and I set the small leather pouch from my father's tool chest on the table between us. I need to tell you something, I said, and I need to tell it to all of you, actually, not just Diane. I looked around the table. Marcus, Emily, her husband, Lucy curled sleepily against Emily's side, Margaret standing a few feet away with her arms crossed. I've spent the last 2 weeks being furious that the people I love the most were the ones who almost took everything from me. But I owe every one of you an honest accounting too, because I haven't been entirely truthful with this family for a long time, and pretending otherwise tonight, after everything I just said about looking clearly at the people around me, would make me exactly the hypocrite Diane's toast accused me of being. I told them then in front of everyone about the tremor, about retiring 4 years ago, not because I was tired of the work, but because my hands had started shaking too badly to trust in a courtroom, and how ashamed I'd been of that, ashamed enough to lie to my own wife for 4 straight years rather than admit that the one thing I'd built my entire identity on, a hand steady enough to be trusted, was slowly failing me. I told them I understood, in a strange and complicated way, exactly why a person might build an entire second life around a secret they were too afraid to bring into the light, even though what I'd hidden and what Diane had hidden were not remotely the same thing. And I wanted to be honest that I saw the difference clearly. I'm not saying that to excuse anything that happened here tonight, I said, looking at Diane, who was crying quietly now, the first real tears I'd seen from her since this whole thing started. What you did wasn't a secret born out of shame. It was a choice sustained over 18 months that could have ended with a court declaring me incompetent to manage my own life. Those aren't the same thing, and I need you to understand I know that difference completely. But I also need this family to understand that I've spent years being just as afraid to be fully seen as anyone else at this table. My father wrote me a letter 40 years ago, telling me a man who spends his life looking for the lie in other people owes it to the people he loves to actually look at them instead of past them. I've been failing at that for longer than just these last 2 weeks, and I wanted you all to know that before I say what I need to say next. I opened the small leather pouch and took out my father's second letter, the one about my mother, about the 2 years in the middle of their marriage when things had nearly ended. And I read it aloud, not the whole thing, but enough for the table to go quiet in an entirely different way than it had 20 minutes earlier. Enough for Lucy, half asleep against her mother's shoulder, to lift her head and ask, in the clear, unguarded voice only a 7-year-old can manage in a moment like that, "Grandpa, why is everybody sad? I thought we were celebrating that you and Grandma love each other." Nobody answered her right away. I don't think anybody could. "We are, sweetheart," I said finally. And it was true in a more complicated way than I could have explained to a 7-year-old, and probably truer than anything else said in that room all night. Sometimes loving somebody for a long time means going through hard, honest conversations so that whatever comes next is real instead of just easy. I looked at Diane across the table. "I'm not going to pretend tonight didn't happen," I told her, quietly enough that it stayed mostly between the two of us, even with the rest of the family close enough to hear. "I don't know yet what this means for us. I don't think you fully know either, but I am not going to let anyone, not Ray Doyle, not Corinne Ashford, and not my own fear of looking foolish, turn me into a man who signs his life away just to avoid one uncomfortable conversation. As trustee of my father's family trust, I amended the beneficiary provisions 2 days ago, entirely within my legal authority, to remove any language that could ever again be used to argue I'm incapable of managing my own affairs. That was never yours to take from me, Diane. It was mine to protect, and I did. There was no dramatic signing scene, no villain forced to hand over a fortune they'd never legally possessed. That part of it had already been quietly, legally handled days before the party ever started. Exactly the way it should have been, because the truth, the plain, unglamorous truth, is that the most powerful thing I did in this entire story wasn't confronting anyone in a banquet hall. It was sitting with a lawyer 8 days earlier and exercising the authority that had been mine all along, calmly, correctly, without needing anyone's permission or forgiveness to do it. Deanne and I separated 4 months after that night. I won't tell you it was simple, or that either of us walked away from 31 years without real grief attached to it, because that wouldn't be honest, and I promised you honesty going into this. She wrote me a letter, eventually, admitting that Corinne and Ray had spent the better part of 2 years working on her, slowly flattering her, convincing her that the life she and I had built together had somehow been small, that she deserved more attention than a retired document examiner puttering around a garage workshop could give her. And admitting, too, that at some point in the middle of all that flattery, she had stopped fighting it and made choices nobody else made for her. I believe both things can be true at once. I've spent a lifetime learning to hold two true things at the same time without needing one to cancel out the other. Marcus and I talk every week now, more than we had in the 8 months before that party, because a silence, once it's finally broken, has a way of teaching two people how much they miss talking honestly. Emily brings Lucy over most Sunday afternoons, and my granddaughter has taken a genuine delighted interest in the watchmaking tools in my garage, small hands turning tiny gears under a magnifying loupe far too big for her face, asking me the same question my father must have heard from me 60 years ago. How do you know which part is broken just by looking at it? I tell her the same thing my father told me. You don't just look at the part that's broken. You look at the whole thing carefully, honestly, until you understand how every piece fits against every other piece, and then, and only then, you'll see exactly where the truth was hiding all along. I still keep my father's letter in that same drawer, folded the same way I found it 37 years ago, beside his old wedding ring and the second letter about my mother that I read aloud to my family on the worst and most honest night of my life. Some mornings, When the tremor's bad, I sit at that workbench anyway, not because I need to fix anything, but because my hands, unsteady as they've become, still remember exactly how to hold something delicate without breaking it. They said I was too old to see any of it coming. I spent 35 years teaching people that the truth is never really hidden. It's just waiting for someone patient enough and honest enough to actually look.